The Marfa Desert at dusk was a place where time seemed to pause. The horizon stretched endlessly, fading from burnt orange to inky blue. Clara Hayes stood alone, her boots crunching softly against the dry earth. The desert air was eerily still, yet it carried a strange, metallic tang that lingered on her tongue. Somewhere in the distance, a low hum vibrated, faint but persistent, like a song just out of reach. She adjusted her camera bag, muttering under her breath, "A bunch of lights in the middle of nowhere. Sure, that's worth a 3-hour drive." Clara was here to debunk a local legend for her latest article, the infamous Marfa Lights. Glowing orbs that appeared without warning, danced over the desert, and then vanished as quickly as they came. Locals swore they were ghosts or spirits, but Clara wasn't buying it. As the first stars blinked into the sky, a flicker caught her eye. There, just above the horizon, soft orbs of light appeared, glowing like pale embers. They drifted lazily, splitting apart, merging again, and then darting in unpredictable patterns. For a moment, Clara forgot to breathe. The lights were beautiful but unsettling, their movements too fluid, too purposeful. She felt the hair on her arms rise as the hum grew louder, thrumming in her chest. The faint smell of burning wood wafted through the air, though there was no fire in sight. She shook herself, pulling out her camera. "It's just atmospheric gases," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "Heat waves, refraction, something logical." The lens focused, capturing the eerie dance of the lights. But as she clicked away, her stomach twisted with a sense of unease she couldn't quite shake. Back at the tiny motel on the edge of town, Clara sifted through her research. Most of it was the usual small-town folklore, ghost stories, warnings to travelers, and cryptic tales of those who had vanished after seeing the lights. Then she found the diary. The leather was cracked, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. Scrawled on the inside cover were the words, "Property of Elias Crane, 1895. She flipped through it, skimming entries about ranch life and descriptions of the lights. But near the end, the tone shifted. "The lights are not what they seem," one entry read. "I've seen their true faces, hollow eyes that bore into your soul. They follow me now, even in the daylight. I fear they've come for me." Clara swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she turned to the last page. It was short, written in hurried, uneven script. "To anyone who finds this, leave. Leave before it's too late. The lights—" The sentence ended abruptly, the pen trailing off the page. A chill seeped into the room, and Clara glanced toward the window. The lights were there, brighter now, glowing just beyond the glass. They seemed closer than they had in the desert, their movements more deliberate. She stood frozen, the diary slipping from her hands. Then she heard it, a faint, raspy whisper curling around her like smoke. "You're next." Elias Crane was a name whispered in Marfa with a mix of reverence and fear. He'd been an ordinary rancher once, tending cattle and mending fences until the lights came for him. Clara pieced together his story from the scraps left behind in the town's archives and the wary recollections of locals. They described Elias as a man consumed, first with curiosity, then with terror. The diary told of his first encounter, lights hovering over his fields like will-o'-the-wisps, unnervingly silent, yet pulsating with a cold, unnatural glow. At first, he thought it was a trick of the heat or the reflection of lanterns in the distance. But the lights followed him, circling his ranch like predators. His cattle spooked, refusing to graze near the scorched patches of earth where the lights lingered. Elias wrote of sleepless nights spent clutching his rifle by the window, eyes fixed on the dancing orbs. The lights seemed to taunt him, their movements almost playful, yet their presence carried an undeniable menace. Then came the whispers, soft at first, like the rustle of dry leaves, growing louder until they seemed to echo inside his skull. The last anyone saw of Elias was a week after he'd confided in the local preacher, begging for an exorcism. When neighbors finally worked up the courage to visit his ranch, they found the front door ajar and his house eerily quiet. Inside, the walls were blackened with soot, and the air reeked of burning. No trace of Elias was ever found, save for the charred handprint seared into the door. Clara shivered as she read. The legend didn't end with Elias. Over the years, stories of the lights intensified. She spent the next day interviewing locals, their faces shadowed with unease as they spoke. Mrs. Valdez, the owner of a small antique shop, shared how her brother had gone missing after a hunting trip near the burial ground. He was never one to believe in ghost stories, she said, her voice trembling. But that night, he called me, babbling about lights chasing him through the brush. We found his truck abandoned, and his boots were left by a creek, but not a sign of him. The retired Sheriff Tate was harder to crack, but eventually he shared his grim memories. "I've seen those bodies," he muttered, his eyes distant. "Men who thought they could outsmart the desert. Found 'em with faces twisted like they'd seen the devil himself. And their eyes." He paused, running a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Burned to a crisp, like someone had snuffed out their light from the inside." Each story carried a thread of dread, but it was the elder, a stooped man wrapped in a faded poncho, who delivered the most chilling revelation. "The lights ain't just spirits," he warned Clara, his voice barely more than a croak. "They're guardians. They protect the old ways, the sacred ground, but if they sense fear, you're as good as gone. Mark my words, Nina, don't let them see your fear." Clara's skepticism wavered. As she reviewed her notes, another detail caught her eye, a pattern. The lights appeared more frequently during the blood moon, a phenomenon only days away. The timing wasn't lost on her. Coincidence? She doubted it. As evening fell, Clara left the archives, her thoughts racing. The dry desert wind brushed against her face as she approached her car, the fading light painting the sky in eerie hues of orange and violet. She slid into the driver's seat, her fingers fumbling for the keys, but the engine wouldn't start. "Not now," she muttered, frustration mounting. She stepped out to check under the hood, her boots crunching on the gravel. That's when she saw it, the faint glow of the lights reflecting in her rearview mirror. They weren't distant this time. Clara's breath caught as the lights flickered closer, illuminating the darkness in a soft, ghostly glow. Shadows stretched and twisted around her, moving in ways they shouldn't. She felt a cold, creeping dread coil around her spine. And then, just beyond the edge of the light, a whisper. "You're not alone." The sun dipped low as Clara stood at the edge of the desert, her shadow stretching long across the cracked earth. She clutched her camera tightly, its weight somehow grounding her, as she prepared to hike toward a known hot spot for the lights. The townsfolk had warned her most wouldn't dare venture out here alone, especially not with the blood moon so close. But Clara wasn't most people. The trek was grueling. Each step stirred up fine dust that clung to her boots, and the silence of the desert was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of dry brush. As she neared her destination, she noticed strange markings carved into the jagged rocks surrounding a small clearing. They looked ancient, their jagged lines and spirals oddly familiar. Clara rifled through her bag, pulling out Elias's diary, and there they were, etched into the brittle pages. The symbols matched perfectly. A chill prickled her skin despite the warmth of the day. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. She set up her camera, positioning it toward the horizon where the lights were said to appear. Hours passed. The sky deepened into a rich indigo, and the first stars began to twinkle. Then, just as her patience began to waver, the lights emerged. They started as faint glimmers, like distant fireflies. But as Clara stared, they grew brighter, pulsing rhythmically as if they had their own heartbeat. Her breath hitched when the lights began to drift closer, weaving through the darkness like luminous serpents. Suddenly, the air turned frigid, her breath visible in short, sharp puffs. A low, guttural hum filled the clearing, vibrating through her chest. Clara's camera captured everything, but her hand shook as she adjusted the focus. And then she saw it, just for a moment. A figure stood within the largest orb of light, its form shimmering and indistinct, like it was caught between worlds. It was humanoid, but its proportions were wrong, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Clara's legs locked, fear rooting her in place as the figure turned toward her, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. She blinked, and it was gone. The lights hovered motionless now, as if daring her to move. Clara's pulse pounded in her ears, her rational mind scrambling for an explanation. Heat, mirage, ball lightning, hallucination from exhaustion. Yet none of it fit. "I'm not crazy," she muttered under her breath, her voice shaking. She pressed record on her camera again, whispering her observations in a futile attempt to anchor herself. "It's just lights, right? Just lights." But her confidence cracked as the hum grew louder, reverberating deep in her bones. She could almost hear whispers layered beneath the sound, words just out of reach. The camera glitched. The screen flickered, distorting the footage. Clara cursed, smacking the side of the device, but the hum only grew louder. The lights surrounded her now, their glow casting long, shifting shadows on the rocks. Then, close to her ear, a voice rasped, low and urgent. "Run! They're watching!" Her blood turned to ice. She recognized the voice. It was Elias. Clara stumbled into her motel room, her nerves still raw from the encounter in the desert. She locked the door and drew the curtains. The faint glow of the Marfa Lights still burned into her vision. The symbols from the rocks haunted her thoughts. She spread Elias's diary across the small desk, flipping back and forth between the entries, her flashlight casting jittery shadows on the walls. The symbols had to mean something more than warnings. The diary hinted at rituals, fragmented instructions buried between desperate ramblings. Elias had tried to banish the lights, but it was clear something had gone terribly wrong. Determined, Clara grabbed her laptop and scoured every obscure forum, local legend, and historical record she could find. Her search finally led her to a forgotten tome digitized in a university archive. The symbols were part of an ancient Apache ritual designed to bind restless spirits, spirits angered by desecration of sacred lands. The ritual demanded absolute precision. One wrong move, and the spirits would turn their wrath on the one attempting it. Clara's stomach sank as a chilling realization hit her. Elias hadn't just failed the ritual, he'd unleashed the lights. And then another piece of the puzzle fell into place. A scanned ledger from the 1890s listed Elias Crane's business partner, William Hayes. Clara froze, the name leaping off the page. Her great-grandfather. Her heart raced as she pieced it together. William must have been with Elias during the original ritual. When it failed, Elias vanished, but William fled. The curse hadn't died with Elias. It had been passed down, and now Clara bore its weight. Her family had carried the guilt and the burden for generations, unwittingly tied to the vengeful spirits. A cold draft brushed her neck, and she spun around, heart pounding. The room was silent, save for her shallow breathing. She turned back to the desk, only to notice an envelope that hadn't been there before. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open. Inside were several brittle, yellowed pages, the missing entries from Elias's diary. Scrawled in uneven handwriting was a single warning. The blood moon awakens their rage. You must complete what I could not, or they will consume us all. The final line sent a chill through her. They know your fear, Clara. You cannot hide. A sudden knock on the motel door shattered the silence. She jumped, clutching the pages tightly. No one was supposed to know she was here. She peered through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. Another knock, louder this time. Then from behind her, a whisper. "Finish it, Clara." She spun around, but the room was empty. Her pulse thundered in her ears as the lights outside her window flared brighter, their glow seeping through the thin curtains. The shadows they cast began to move, elongating and twisting unnaturally. Clara's instincts screamed at her to run, but she was rooted in place. The lights pulsed, their rhythm hypnotic, drawing her toward the window. Her phone buzzed violently on the desk, snapping her out of the trance. She grabbed it, her eyes scanning the screen. A single message from an unknown number. 3 nights left. Prepare. The room plunged into darkness as the lights outside vanished, leaving Clara alone with only the hum of her shallow breath and the weight of the diary pages in her hands. Clara stood at the edge of the desert, the blood moon casting an eerie red glow over the landscape. Her backpack was stuffed with the ritual ingredients: candles, herbs wrapped in faded cloth, and the ancient dagger, its blade glinting faintly under the crimson light. She double-checked Elias's notes, her fingers tracing the smudged instructions. Every step had to be perfect, or this would end in disaster. The journey to the ritual site felt longer than before. The desert seemed to shift around her, each shadow a potential threat. The wind whispered through the rocks, carrying faint voices that sent chills down her spine. Every so often, she'd catch a flicker of light in the distance, like a beacon luring her deeper. Finally, she reached the flat expanse marked by a circle of ancient stones. Clara set her supplies down, her breaths quick and shallow. The wind died suddenly, leaving an unnatural stillness. The air smelled of ozone and decay. She arranged the candles in a precise pattern, lit them with shaky hands, and placed the herbs in the center. The dagger rested on a cloth at her side, its presence both comforting and terrifying. With a deep breath, Clara began to chant the words from the diary, her voice trembling at first but growing steadier. The lights appeared, faint at first, then growing brighter and more erratic. They circled the stones, their movements frantic, almost agitated. The air turned icy, each breath forming a mist in front of her. Then came the faces, horribly distorted, twisted in agony. Clara recognized Elias immediately, his hollow eyes pleading silently. Her great-grandfather's face followed, his expression a mixture of regret and fear. The lights converged, spiraling into a massive vortex above her. From the center, a figure began to emerge, its form shifting and unstable. It solidified into a towering shadow with hollow, glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through Clara's soul. The Shadow King. Its voice was a low, resonant growl, vibrating through the ground. "You have come to end this, child of haze, but are you prepared to pay the price?" Clara's voice faltered. "What do you want from me?" The figure leaned closer, its presence suffocating. "A life for a life. Sacrifice yourself, and your bloodline will be freed. Refuse, and the curse will remain. Your family will suffer forever." The words struck her like a blow, and for a moment, Clara's resolve wavered. She gripped the dagger tightly, its cold handle grounding her. Could she do it? Could she end this once and for all, even if it meant losing herself? The lights surged, swirling faster, their hum growing into a deafening roar. Clara's heartbeat matched the frantic rhythm. The Shadow King raised an arm, its massive claw pointing directly at her. "Choose, Clara. The time is now." Tears streamed down her face as she raised the dagger, its edge gleaming ominously. Her hands shook as the figure began to lunge toward her, its hollow eyes burning brighter, its twisted form blotting out the blood moon above. The Shadow King lunged, and Clara acted on instinct. With a cry that echoed across the barren desert, she plunged the dagger into her chest. A blinding light erupted from the blade, engulfing her and the vortex of spirits. The guttural hum turned into a deafening wail, then silence. The lights fractured, scattering like shards of glass before vanishing into the cold night. Clara collapsed to the ground, her body motionless. The blood moon dimmed, and the desert returned to its solemn stillness. By the time the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, there was no trace of Clara, no footprints, no dagger, nothing but the smoldering remains of the ritual candles. Back in town, the Marfa Lights never appeared again. The townspeople whispered of the journalist who had come seeking answers and vanished without a trace. Some believed she had fallen victim to the curse, while others said she had faced down the spirits and freed them. Clara Hayes became a local legend, her name spoken with reverence and sorrow. Years passed, and the desert settled into its quiet existence, undisturbed by flickering lights or chilling tales. The town moved on, though Clara's story lingered in dusty photo albums and old newspaper clippings. Decades later, a young family moved into Clara's childhood home. It was a charming house with creaky floorboards and a view of the wide-open Texas sky. On their first night, as they unpacked boxes, their youngest child stood by the window, staring out into the vast darkness. "Mommy, look," the child whispered, pointing at the horizon. The mother glanced over, distracted. "What is it, sweetheart?" The child's voice was soft, almost dreamy. "The pretty lights." The mother walked to the window, peering out into the night, but the desert was still. There was nothing there, only the distant outline of the mountains. "Come on now, it's late," she said, gently pulling the child away. But the little one lingered, eyes fixed on the empty expanse. "They're dancing," the child murmured, a faint smile on their lips. "They're coming closer." And for a moment, just a fleeting second, the faintest flicker appeared on the horizon, a soft glow that shimmered and then vanished, leaving only the quiet, endless desert. The Shadow King lunged, and Clara acted on instinct. With a cry that echoed across the barren desert, she plunged the dagger into her chest. A blinding light erupted from the blade, engulfing her in the vortex of spirits. The guttural hum turned into a deafening wail, then silence. The lights fractured, scattering like shards of glass before vanishing into the cold night. Clara collapsed to the ground, her body motionless. The blood moon dimmed, and the desert returned to its solemn stillness. By the time the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, there was no trace of Clara. No footprints, no dagger, nothing but the smoldering remains of the ritual candles. Back in town, the Marfa Lights never appeared again. The townspeople whispered of the journalist who had come seeking answers and vanished without a trace. Some believed she had fallen victim to the curse, while others said she had faced down the spirits and freed them. Clara Hayes became a local legend, her name spoken with reverence and sorrow. Years passed, and the desert settled into its quiet existence, undisturbed by flickering lights or chilling tales. The town moved on, though Clara's story lingered in dusty photo albums and old newspaper clippings. Decades later, a young family moved into Clara's childhood home. It was a charming house with creaky floorboards and a view of the wide-open Texas sky. On their first night, as they unpacked boxes, their youngest child stood by the window, staring out into the vast darkness. "Mommy, look!" the child whispered, pointing at the horizon. The mother glanced over, distracted. "What is it, sweetheart?" The child's voice was soft, almost dreamy. "The pretty lights." The mother walked to the window, peering out into the night. But the desert was still. There was nothing there, only the distant outline of the mountains. "Come on now, it's late," she said, gently pulling the child away. But the little one lingered, eyes fixed on the empty expanse. "They're dancing," the child murmured, a faint smile on their lips. "They're coming closer." And for a moment, just a fleeting second, the faintest flicker appeared on the horizon, a soft glow that shimmered and then vanished, leaving only the quiet, endless desert. The lights had returned,